My mom sent a picture of a pepperoni pizza to our family group chat while I was lying in the intensive care unit. The caption said, "Best family night we've had in years." My younger brother replied with laughing emojis. My dad sent a thumbs up. My aunt commented that mom deserved a break after everything she'd been through. No one mentioned me. And no one asked how my surgery had gone. And no one wondered if I was still alive. I stared at that picture through blurry eyes while machines beeped beside my bed. The nurse standing next to me quietly turned my phone face down. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Because 24 hours earlier, I'd signed papers my mother knew nothing about, papers my grandfather had spent 5 years preparing, papers that legally removed every bit of control my family thought they had over my future. Those signatures weren't revenge. They were protection. And by the time my mother realized what I'd done, it was already too late. But before I tell you why those papers changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy realistic family drama with unexpected endings, consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this waiting for you. Now, let me take you back. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 now. When people meet me today, they usually describe me as calm, responsible, reliable. What they don't know is that I became all those things because someone had to. Growing up, our house revolved around my younger brother, Mason. Everything good belonged to him. Every excuse belonged to him too. If he forgot his homework, the teacher was unfair. If he broke something, it was an accident. If he failed a class, the school didn't support him enough. When I brought home straight A's, Mom would smile without looking up from her phone. "That's nice, honey." Then she'd ask whether I'd help Mason study. I stopped expecting congratulations before I was old enough to drive. Dad wasn't cruel. He was simply absent even when he sat in the same room. Whenever Mom made excuses for Mason, Dad nodded. Whenever I tried explaining how unfair things felt, Dad would sigh. "You know how your mother is." That became the answer to everything. "You know how your mother is." At T12, I started cooking dinner twice a week. At 14, I babysat Mason because Mom said she deserved a break. At T16, I got my first job at a grocery store. Half my paycheck went toward household bills. Mom called it contributing. Mason called it my responsibility. Nobody ever asked if I wanted to spend my weekends working while my friends went to football games. I just did it, because saying no usually created a bigger problem than saying yes. If you've ever felt like the invisible child in your family, you'll probably understand exactly what I mean. The strange thing about being overlooked isn't that people yell at you. It's that they stop seeing you altogether. Birthdays became smaller every year. Mine anyway. Mason's 16th birthday included a rented banquet room, a DJ, and nearly 60 guests. My 16th birthday was a grocery store cake Mom picked up on her way home from work because she'd forgotten to order one. She apologized, briefly. Then she reminded me birthdays weren't about presents, they were about family. I smiled, because arguing would have ruined everyone else's evening. Grandpa Walter noticed. He always noticed. He lived 40 minutes away in the old farmhouse where my dad grew up. Every other Saturday, he'd call. "You busy, Em? I can make time." "Good. Come help an old man fix something." There was always something to fix. A fence, a porch step, a leaking faucet. Sometimes nothing actually needed repairing. Sometimes he simply wanted company. Those Saturdays became my escape. Grandpa never talked down to me. He listened. Really listened. One afternoon, while we were repainting the porch swing, he looked at me for a long moment. "You carry too much." I laughed. "I carry paint buckets." "No." He kept brushing the wood. "You carry everyone else's expectations." I didn't know how to answer. Because he was right. "I wish Mom saw me the way you do." He set his brush down. "Emily." His voice became unusually serious. "Some people only recognize value after they lose it." I thought he was talking about family. Years later, I'd realize he meant something much bigger. Grandma Evelyn passed away when I was 19. The funeral brought relatives from everywhere. Everyone cried, everyone hugged, everyone promised we'd stay close. By the following month, nothing had changed. Mom still complained about money. Dad still avoided conflict. Mason still bounced between part-time jobs without keeping any of them for long. Only Grandpa seemed different, quieter. He started organizing old photographs, sorting files, meeting with lawyers. I noticed because I was usually the one driving him into town. One afternoon I asked whether everything was okay. He smiled. I'm putting things where they belong. I assumed he meant his will. I never asked another question. I wish I had, because those quiet trips into town were setting something enormous into motion, something none of us, not even my parents, understood yet. And years later, those very documents would become the reason my mother's smile disappeared the moment she finally saw my signature. But before any of that happened, life gave me a decision I never expected to make. The decision came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished my shift at the accounting firm where I'd worked since graduating college when my phone rang. It was Grandpa. His voice sounded weaker than usual. Emily, can you come by? Of course. You don't have to rush. I'll be there in 40 minutes. When I pulled into his driveway, I immediately knew something was wrong. His truck sat crooked beside the barn. The porch light was still on even though the sun hadn't set. Grandpa was sitting in his favorite chair, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm weather. He smiled when he saw me. You always come. You always call. He chuckled. I suppose that's fair. We spent an hour talking about everything except the real reason he'd asked me there. Then he surprised me. Walk with me. We slowly crossed the property toward the old oak tree near the back fence. It had been there longer than anyone in our family could remember. Grandpa rested one hand against the trunk. Your grandmother loved this tree. I know. When she got sick, she'd sit right here. He looked toward the fields. I've made arrangements. For what? For whatever comes next. His words settled heavily between us. I don't want to talk like you're leaving. I'm 82, Emily. He smiled gently. I'd rather prepare than pretend. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a business card. Margaret Dawson, estate attorney. If she ever calls you, answer. If she asks you to sign something, read every page. And trust her. I looked at him, confused. What is this about? He simply squeezed my shoulder. You'll understand when it's time. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 months later, Grandpa suffered a massive stroke. The hospital became our second home. Mom cried loudly in waiting rooms. She posted daily updates on Facebook asking everyone to pray. Hundreds of comments poured in. People praised her devotion. What nobody saw was that she rarely stayed more than 15 minutes inside Grandpa's room. Most of the time she stood in the hallway taking phone calls, discussing insurance, property taxes, the farmhouse, the land. She never asked the nurses whether Grandpa had eaten. She asked whether he'd updated his will. I heard it with my own ears. One evening she cornered his physician. If he recovers, when can legal paperwork be signed? The doctor stared at her. Mrs. Carter, our priority is helping your father survive. She nodded politely, then immediately asked again. That night, something changed inside me. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for her. Grandpa passed away 6 days later. The funeral was beautiful. The speeches were beautiful. Mom's tears looked genuine. Maybe some of them were. Grief is complicated. But even before everyone had left the cemetery, I saw my parents standing beside their car with my Uncle David. They weren't talking about memories. They were discussing acreage. I remember hearing one sentence as clearly as if it had been whispered directly into my ear. If we sell before winter, we'll get top dollar. I looked back toward Grandpa's grave. The flowers hadn't even settled into the soil. That was the moment I realized something painful. Some people mourn the person, others mourn the opportunity. A week later, my phone rang. A known number. I almost ignored it. Then I remembered the business card. Emily, This is Margaret Dawson. I'm sorry for your loss. My heart started beating faster. I believe your grandfather asked you to expect my call. Yes, he did. I'd like to meet with you. Alone. 2 days later, I sat across from her in a quiet office overlooking downtown. She opened a thick folder. I represented your grandparents for many years. She smiled kindly. Your grandfather trusted you deeply. I swallowed. He trusted everyone. Margaret slowly shook her head. No, he trusted very few people. She slid a sealed envelope across the desk. It had Grandpa's handwriting. For Emily, only after my passing. Inside was a handwritten letter. He thanked me. Not for my grades, not for helping around the farm, not for visiting. He thanked me for showing up when nobody asked me to, for choosing people over possessions, for making him feel less alone after Grandma died. By the time I reached the last paragraph, I was crying too hard to continue. Margaret quietly handed me another tissue. Then she opened a second folder. This is why he asked you here. Inside were legal documents, trust papers, property records, investment statements, bank accounts, everything carefully organized. I don't understand. Margaret folded her hands. Your grandfather established a private family trust several years ago. He transferred certain assets into that trust while he was still alive, so they never became part of probate. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means... She paused carefully. Your parents are expecting an inheritance they legally cannot claim. The room felt strangely quiet. What? Your grandfather appointed you as successor trustee. I blinked several times. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. I don't want to fight with my family, Margaret smiled sadly. Neither did your grandfather. That's exactly why he planned ahead. Then she said something I'll never forget. He told me, Emily will never choose herself unless someone protects her first. The words broke something inside me, because they were true. For 27 years, I'd always chosen everyone else. I had no idea that within weeks, life would force me to make the biggest sacrifice of all, and it wouldn't be for my grandfather. It would be for the very family that never saw my worth. I thought the hardest conversations were behind me. I was wrong. The surgery lasted almost 9 hours. I don't remember being wheeled into the operating room. I remember signing the last consent form. I remember the anesthesiologist asking me to count backward from 10. I remember thinking about Grandpa's letter. Then, nothing. The next thing I knew, everything hurt. Not the kind of pain that makes you scream, the kind that makes breathing feel like lifting concrete. When I finally opened my eyes, the ceiling above me was white, machines surrounded my bed. A heart monitor beeped steadily. Someone noticed I was awake. Emily, it was a nurse. She smiled. Welcome back. My throat felt like sandpaper. How long? You've been in the ICU since yesterday afternoon. Yesterday. An entire day had disappeared. The nurse adjusted one of the monitors before speaking again. Your surgery was successful. You gave someone a second chance. I nodded weakly. I couldn't even whisper. My body simply didn't have the strength. About an hour later, she handed me my phone. You've had quite a few notifications. I expected messages asking how I was doing. Maybe Dad. Maybe my cousins. Maybe co-workers. Instead, the first notification was from our family group chat. Mom had uploaded a picture. A large pepperoni pizza, garlic bread, chicken wings. Everyone was smiling around the dining table. Even Dad. The caption stopped me cold. Finally getting life back to normal. Family dinner without all the stress. We deserved hundreds of reactions. Heart emojis, comments from relatives. So happy things are getting better. You look exhausted, Linda. Take care of yourself. Family always comes first. I stared at the screen. I wasn't in the picture. No one had mentioned I was still lying in intensive care. No one had even written, Emily is recovering. The nurse quietly looked over at my phone. Her expression changed. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry." Those two words hurt more than the incision across my abdomen because they came from someone who owed me nothing. While my own family didn't even notice I was missing from their celebration, a few minutes later my phone buzzed again. It was Dad. For one brief second, I smiled. Maybe he'd finally remembered. Maybe he was calling from the hospital lobby. Maybe he was coming upstairs. Instead, his text read, "When you're feeling better, call your mom. She's upset you haven't thanked everyone for supporting you." I read it 3 times. Supporting me? I looked around the ICU room. The flowers beside my bed were from co-workers. The blanket was from my best friend Rachel. The card on the table had been signed by nurses from my previous volunteer program. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had come from my family. I set the phone down. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to explain their behavior. I simply accepted it. The following morning, Margaret Dawson walked quietly into my room. She wasn't carrying flowers. She carried a leather folder. "You look stronger. I feel different." She smiled gently. "I imagine you do." She pulled a chair beside my bed. "I know this isn't the best timing, but there are a few things your grandfather wanted handled only after you recovered." She opened the folder. Inside were the same trust documents we'd discussed weeks earlier. "This is entirely your decision. You don't have to sign today." I looked at Grandpa's signature on the original trust. Then I remembered something he'd once told me. Some people mistake kindness for permission. For years, I'd given everyone permission to overlook me. Not anymore. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled. The pain medication made everything feel slightly unreal. Even so, I signed every page carefully. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of responsibility. When I finished, Margaret quietly placed the documents back inside the folder. "From this moment forward, everything your grandfather protected remains protected. No one can force a sale. No one can transfer ownership. No one can pressure you into signing anything." I let out a slow breath. For the first time in years, I felt safe. I had no idea at that exact moment. My mother was sitting across town in a real estate office, smiling, discussing how quickly Grandpa's farmhouse could be listed. She believed everything was already hers. She had absolutely no idea. The papers I'd just signed had already changed the outcome. And when she finally learned the truth, it wouldn't happen in private. It would happen in front of everyone who believed her version of the story. She just didn't know that yet.